Hello, Perspectives in Child Maltreatment. Today we're talking about physical abuse. This is module 4. And from our other chapters on the history of child maltreatment, both as a phenomenon and as a discipline in academia, you would remember that the first type of child maltreatment that was identified by a professional community was child physical abuse. So we can date this back to the publication of the seminal article, Child Syndrome. And so after the publication of the Battered Child Syndrome, child physical abuse was on the map in terms of both academia and as a discipline of child intervention, child abuse prevention and intervention. So child physical abuse is currently the most frequently reported form of maltreatment. It is the most commonly prosecuted, and because of bruising and physical marks left on a child, it is identifiable where other forms of abuse may not be. So to define some key terms here, we have incidence. This is the number of new cases in a year, and prevalence. Prevalence rates speak to the number of cases that exist in a specific population at a given point in time. So if we talk about the prevalence of child abuse currently in the United States, we could have statistics that tell us how often these happen on average. Now, a substantiated case of child abuse occurs when a report has been confirmed. So when we're defining child physical abuse, the specific terminology used in different laws vary from state to state. So let's look at a few different states and see how they word child physical abuse. In Alabama, harm or threatened harm to the health or welfare of a child. So that harm or threatened harm, abuse in Connecticut, means that a child or youth has been inflicted with physical injury or injuries by other than accidental means. So the key phrasing there, other than accidental. The fourth National Incidence Study, the NIS-4, defines physical abuse as shaking, throwing, purposefully dropping a child, hitting, pushing, grabbing, dragging, or pulling, punching or kicking, and other physical abuse. So in Connecticut, there is some very objective terminology, gets very specific. If you look at the previous definitions of Alabama, harm or threatened harm, it would be upon a prosecutor's responsibility to prove that threatened harm, that harm was threatened. In Connecticut, it would mean that other than accidental means, right? So this was not an accident, the child was injured. But the NIS-4, a national study, gets very specific in operationalizing, right, what kinds of actions are abusive. So in our state, an abused child means a child whose parent, guardian, custodian, or any person responsible for his or her care or support, whether or not legally obligated to do so, has caused or allowed to be caused upon the child non-accidental physical injury or other maltreatment. So the term abused child also means a child who is or has been trafficked within the meaning of Mississippi Human Trafficking Act by any person without regard to the relationship of the person to the child. So here you have the definition of child physical abuse, but then you also have a discussion of human trafficking. We have a module on human trafficking we will look at. So this harm versus threatened harm, or even risk of harm. So the language in the state law is important. Threat to harm or risk of harm is difficult to prove. So if you have a parent who gets mad at a child, the child's not doing what they have asked them to do, and they lose their temper and they kick a chair. If the chair is then, because of the force of the kick, if the chair then is then almost hits the child, if the chair almost strikes the child, is this a threat to harm? Is this a risk of harm? We would say, yeah, but it could be debated. So it is important that social workers, law enforcement officers, that these frontline child abuse investigators understand that they're going to have to make a case if they file charges, or if a child is removed from a home. If they cite one of these state laws, threat of harm, risk of harm, they need to have some kind of precedence. They need to have some kind of proof that this action was threatening to the child. States can specify abuse. In Illinois, female circumcision is physical abuse. In Florida, purposefully giving poison, alcohol, drugs, or other substances is abuse. And when we look at corporal punishment, this is oftentimes associated in very religious communities, as ours is here in Mississippi. The scriptural reference, spoil the rod, spare the rod, spoil the child. The King James Version of the Bible actually says, spare the rod. He who spares the rod hates the child. And so when we're talking about how connected corporal punishment is in Southern culture, we inevitably get into a debate as to the usefulness or the counterproductive nature of this type of punishment. So let's look at defining corporal punishment as abusive or not. Let's look at what the law says. Child physical abuse and physical discipline that is illegal. We're defining these two things. Now, there are countries that have outlawed corporal punishment. They've outlawed spanking in Austria, Denmark, Finland, Germany, Iceland, Israel, Italy, Norway, and Sweden. South Carolina speaks to this. Child abuse and neglect does not include corporal punishment or physical discipline that is reasonable in manner and moderate in degree. So again, when we have state statutes that have words like reasonable or moderate, then it would be kind of the impetus would be on the defense attorney, right? If a parent is being prosecuted for child abuse, the defense attorney has to prove that this physical punishment was reasonable and moderate. So what that can be subjective. So you have to understand that these things are going to be battled out in court. So corporal punishment. Southerners typically are more accepting of physical punishment. Northerners and folks in the West typically oppose physical punishment. Research associates corporal punishment with negative outcomes. We do need to remember that correlation does not show causation. So we also need to look at sampling methods. So for instance, we know that individuals who are raised in poverty are at higher rates of a lot of negative life outcomes. So when you're evaluating a research study on corporal punishment, some questions to ask might be, Is there a diversity ethnically in those studies, ethnically and racially in the samples? Are there other confounding variables, other ACEs, adverse childhood experiences? Is reasonable and moderate corporate or corporal punishment measurable? And if so, have child maltreatment experts and clinicians and scholars, have they measured reasonable and moderate corporal punishment? And how would you define that? In Mississippi, child physical abuse speaks to permanent mark or injury. So bruising would indicate physical abuse. So we would ask, can physical punishment be reasonable and moderate if there's bruising, if there is a mark that's left after 24 hours? So very little research assessed the impact of a spanking ban on child abuse rates. However, 28% of parents, when investigated in countries that have banned corporal punishment, 28% admitted to spanking a child a year after the ban. The rate of physical child abuse was at best unchanged in 20 years in countries that have banned spanking. And currently the relationship between corporal punishment and child physical abuse is unknown. So it is clear, though, that anti-spanking laws don't eliminate spanking, and they don't eliminate child abuse either. So they're not lowering the rate of hospitalizations for physical abuse, those other abusive actions that we will discuss. So what are the consequences of physical abuse? Immediate medical and health problems caused by abuse, bruising, injured capillaries. So the injury damages capillaries, allowing blood to seep into the surrounding tissue. It's generally caused by striking or pressing that does not break the skin. Most common physical injuries associated with child physical abuse are caused by blunt force trauma. So when we're talking about physical abuse, we need to consider the age of the child. Children do not begin to crawl until 6 months, and any bruising prior to this should raise suspicion. Normal bruising occurs as a result of a child exploring their environment. Accidental bruises usually occur on areas of the body where the bone is close to the surface, such as the hands, the front of the hands, kids bracing themselves for a fall. And also here, we would see bruising, oftentimes elbows, scrapes on the forearm there. Normal bruising, we would call low suspicion bruising, occurs as a result of the child figuring out their environment. So new crawlers will strike their foreheads. New walkers will bruise their shins. And bruising that is typical is on the peripheral of the body, on the extremities. Atypical bruising, suspicious bruising, would take place on the ears or the trunk, the genitals, or the back. And so the more interior into the body and the more central into the body, the more suspicious it would be. So when we assess the bruise, one must consider the nature of the bruise. The bruising pattern oftentimes provides information. On multidisciplinary teams where social workers would bring in pictures that they took when called out on an investigation, and taking a picture of a child's thigh where a parent had taken an extension cord and had beat them. And seeing these pictures over time, if you see enough, you can see kind of patterns. You can distinguish between different types of abusive marks. A spoon obviously would leave an oval shaped. Hangers, very thin, but oftentimes breaking the skin, being very severely abusive. I interviewed a child, one of the first interviews in my career as a forensic interviewer, and I asked the child if he ever got a spanking, and he said that he didn't get spanked, he got beat. And then he told me that he got spanked with whatever she could get her hands on, broom handles, extension cords, and a dowel rod that's used to open and close blinds. So these can actually break when parents are hitting their children with such force. These can not only break in two, but they can also break the skin. And they leave, understanding the diameter of these dowel rods, the bruising is oftentimes pretty distinct. If a child reportedly falls from the tree, a child was climbing, and the scenario is that a limb broke, and as they're falling down, they're being hit by limbs. This may not be out of the realm of possibility. Kids climb trees and they fall, but sometimes we can understand that an abuse scenario does not match with the coloring of the bruising. So in 6 to 12 hours, a bruise is usually red. Bruising are blackish and purple. 12 to 24 hours, and 4 to 6 days, they're a dark green. So if there's inconsistencies between the coloring of the bruising and the story, so parents said, oh, this happened weeks ago, but yet the coloring indicates 6 to 12 hours, then this would be suspicious. 5 to 10 days, there's pale green or yellow, more obvious with lighter skinned children. Now, so we would need to consider something about the nature of the bruise, but also bite marks. In dealing with child maltreatment, we see all manner of terrible situations, but we see bite marks. Forensic dentistry has been used to specifically identify someone's bite marks. Now, this is a controversial field. Bite marks have been admitted in court cases only to be retracted in court cases. So this is highly controversial. There have been many convictions overturned. But if you notice something that looks to be like a bite mark, you definitely would need to ask the child, how did you get that bruise? And if they give you something that is inconsistent, such as, well, I fell downstairs. Well, if it looks more like a bite mark and they're saying they fell downstairs, that would be cause for alarm. So suspected physical abuse also leads us to a discussion of fractures. Now, a fracture requires expert training in radiology. Immediately refer to medical doctors if the cause is questionable. Most children receive fractures from abuse are younger than 2 years of age. Between 55 and 70% are younger than 1. And so if you look at the window child abuse, right, most injuries that children would encounter really shouldn't happen before under 5 months, because they're not crawling, and they're crawling from 6 months, and from 6 months to 18 months and 2, they don't have their motor skills. They may fall over, they may bump things, But when they come in with a serious fracture under the age of 2, then this is when the medical examiners, specifically those trained in child abuse evaluation, medical evaluation, we need to distinguish between non-abusive fractures. Less than 2% of all accidental non-abusive fractures are seen in children younger than 18 months. So the red flag is when the caregiver explanation of fracture doesn't correlate with the x-ray. Other suspicious fractures. Fractures discovered for unrelated problems. So a child with pneumonia is x-rayed and the doctor finds a rib fracture. Non-abusive parents are usually aware of the trauma. Abusive parents may not know on which instance they harmed the child, right? So abuse is oftentimes, like if you have a concerned parent and their child falls in a major way, it's gonna really upset them. But for cases where children are abused, oftentimes there really isn't a logical explanation because parents are harming their children, and they're not just going to come out and say that. Head injuries. These are common in abuse cases and potentially fatal. 190 abused children have died from 1965 to 1995. I was born in 76, graduated high school in 95, and in that 18 to 20-year period, many children died because of abuse. And you just fast forward 9 years before I was born, and you look at how rapidly this phenomenon increases. The primary trauma that has taken the life is a head injury. All of these deaths were younger than 48 months, all right, 4 years. That is because the skull is very thick. It is thick boned. However, the younger a child is, the softer it is, the more vulnerable they are. Brain development is taking place, and this is why children are in need of great nurturing and in need of great care. 89% of all fatal head injuries to children were younger than 3 years. 63% were younger than 1 year. And so we're seeing children at the greatest vulnerability, younger than a year, in abusive contexts. So when we look at head injuries, primary trauma, we see a depressed level of consciousness, 64%, respiratory distress, 32%, seizures, 32%, vomiting, 23%, retinal hemorrhage, 41%, and capillary damage, 22.5%. We also need to look at the phenomenon of occult fractures. These are fractures that are not detected by X-rays. They can only be detected by CT scans or MRI scans. So they are harder to detect. Shaken baby syndrome is an often cause of head injury to children who die. It is often renamed or renamed shaken impact syndrome. The injuries that result when young children are violently shaken. This can cause the brain to collide within the skull almost entirely in 2 years and younger. So we see shaken impact syndrome almost exclusively in children under the age of 2. Children younger than 6 months are also among the most vulnerable. Most commonly, there are no external signs. And this happens oftentimes when a parent is just enraged. Oftentimes when they're not getting sleep, they're not getting rest, they're not oftentimes not experienced. They have very, very poor emotional control, obviously. Now, injuries from falls. The falling that takes place with children is oftentimes in very short distances that don't cause significant harm. So a child falls from the bed or sofa. Hospital records of 85 children falling approximately 3 feet from 1997. 57 were not injured. 17 minor injuries such as scrapes or bloody noses. 20 ended up with a bruise. Only one had a skull fracture with no soft tissue damage. So when parents come in and the child has severe skull fractures, and yet they say the child fell off the couch, this is not consistent. There have been research studies that have estimated the amount of force it takes to crack a child's skull, and it is a very, very violent action that has to happen. Simply falling off a bed 3 feet or less is not going to cause the kind of damage that is sometimes presented. Researchers examined data from hospital and daycare settings and public injury databases. The chances of a child dying from a fall less than 4 feet 7 inches is less than 1 in 1 million falls per year. So parents and caregivers who are abusing their children in this way, when they encounter the system, whether that's in the hospital or whether that's a law enforcement or that's social worker, they will oftentimes give explanations for the injury that are totally inconsistent with the science. They say the child fell off the couch and they have bleeding on the brain and a major skull fracture. Right, that's not going to be consistent with the data. Burns. Infants and young children may be burned accidentally, right? So water is a common burning agent. Children getting in the fire or touching an iron. So abusive burns versus accidental burns. Child abuse and abusive burns, where we would say that the burn was intentional. Also, were cases of burning where the parent was extremely neglectful. We're going to parse these out. But child abuse and burns are responsible for 10 to 25% of injuries in childhood. So 10 to 25% of burn injuries are classified as child abuse. Now, any child with burns should be assessed for abuse, period, point blank. So common scenario, mom's running the bath, dad's running the bath, they set the water too hot, child gets in, it's extremely hot, and this is kind of the common burns. Also chemical agents. We also look at children getting access, to the fire, to an iron. A second-degree burn on a child would take 10 seconds in scalding hot water. So if a child's going to be burned, what we're seeing in child abuse is that children are are submerged into a burning water. Also, when a child gets into hot water and it's too hot and they jump out, there are splash burns. Okay, so in cases where children are intentionally burned, what we see are almost like sock burns. So the line, the child may not be flailing, they may be pressed and held underwater so that they are intentionally burned. Discussing these things and talking about these things is inevitably triggering. It's inevitably heartbreaking. And so when we're looking at the child abuse that really happens, we want to be sensitive to these realities. When water heaters are lowered to between 120 to 125, so when we look at the temperature that's set on the hot water heater, mindful parents will take this into consideration. We do not need a hot shower that's going to scald anybody, let alone our child. The threshold of pain response is 114 degrees. So there really is no need for hot water heaters to be set at these really high temperatures. Parents may accidentally place a child in hot water but immediately remove them. Burns to hands and feet. Accidentally placed in extremities. So when they are removed, there's splashing burns. The glove or sock burns, where it would look as if a parent takes the child's hand and forces them underwater. Right? There's more of a symmetrical bruising. That's highly suspicious. Also, suspicious curling iron burns. If there's a curling iron and it's plugged in and it's on a countertop, if it falls, or an iron, what you see is the burn falls, like you see where it burned and kind of trailed down the arm. The abusive curling iron burn would be where it's held and pressed on a child's arms. If parents are not leaving, if parents are leaving curling irons, flat irons, these kind of things plugged in, then that is an education issue. At best, at worst, it's a neglect issue. Right? But what we need to see is that when we see burns nearer the trunk of the body, that's highly suspicious. So curling iron is going to brush up against someone's arm, or it's going to fall on their leg. It's not going to be placed on their torso or on their back. And those abusive burns are the ones that present. The deeper the burn, it's obviously more than grazing. It's just not just going to like graze them. Not likely they would put their foot on a heating grate. Okay, so another type of abuse that we see are these gas heaters where there's a grate and it's hot. Well, there are children whose, they're held up and the bottom of their feet are pressed against this, right? That's just not possible unless it's abuse. So this is kind of the type of logic that abusive parents will provide when they're trying to give an explanation for a bruising. Multiple deep defined burns are more suspicious. Multiple deep defined burns. If you just let that phrasing kind of settle in, it's disturbing, as child abuse is. We need to consider the developmental level. So clearly, if there's significant burning to a child's body and they're not even walking, right? The case can't be made that this was an accidental burn, that they were just walking around and somehow got their feet on the grate of a gas fireplace. Also, clothing used to cover the bruises, long sleeves in the summer that would just really be out of place, would be inconsistent. 1,560 children die from abuse and neglect in 2010. Neglect accounts for 32.6% of fatalities. So in cases where children are not being tortured, and held in scalding hot water, a bigger concern is where children wander into, or children kind of crawl, toddlers especially, where parents just aren't childproofing their home. These are tragic and heartbreaking. This would include leaving a child in the back seat of a car. In Mississippi, these happen. We have heat indexes in 115 degrees. This is brutally hot for anybody, but especially leaving a child in the back seat of a car. We've had cases where parents leave, it's like dad's not he's typically not the one to drop the kid off at daycare. Instead of going to daycare, he goes to his work, parks his car, child's asleep in the back, he just doesn't think about it, goes inside, and 8 hours later comes back, the child's dead. These kind of neglectful deaths, where the parents are so just gut-wrenchingly sorry and heartbroken, but it's still neglect. The legal system is then tasked with assessing a penalty. These can be controversial, but children under the age of 1 year speak to 47.7% of all child fatalities. So half of all neglectful deaths happen with a child under the age of 1. And mothers are accounted for 29% of fatalities. So this is where we see moms kind of at the cause of deaths in 1/3 of cases. We'll have an entire segment on neglect. And again, this is some depressing stuff that we talk about, but to be able to kind of set that aside and kind of look at the risks that children face, and how we as a community can be more capable of protecting and preventing these types of abusive deaths. I think it's clearly a positive thing, and look forward to hearing from you in a discussion board about how we can be more equipped as mandated reporters, frontline child abuse investigators, prosecutors, law enforcement entities and officers, and just mindful, involved citizens. All right, thanks.